Hello, this video will be about faith, hope and charity, and it will connect directly to a series of recent uploads as well as the main themes from my videos going back a couple years now. Looking at the symbolic aspects connected to, well, we'll draw various connections anyway, so faith, hope and charity. Directly previous to this I posted a video on Mammon and I featured the Federation Pavilion here in Centennial Park in Sydney, and well, the whole around the outside it's Mammon or Millennial Eden, and mentioned faith, hope and charity on the inside, and so you have well on the inside here, so it's also an interesting feature. So around the top here what you have is a water channel, and that's designed to cause a reflection on the inside, and so you can see a bit of the effect there. So that's the water, it's early morning, but as it moves around, it creates illuminates certain parts of it. I think it's also interesting here that we have this the light spectrum going on there, but also it's 1,440 tiles now, 144 or 1440 as well. For instance, 3 to the first plus 2 to the second plus 3 to the third is 1,440, but 3 to the first plus 2 to the second plus 3 to the third plus 4 to the fourth is 1440. So there's this really nice 4D thing. I did a recent upload, but it's very symbolic, important number. Now it's important, especially in the Bible, well, multiple references in there, but very also important in weights and measure systems going back pre-Bible times and still in use today, especially connected to Masonic architecture and connections. Now this, just to focus now, I'm going to focus on this mural there. And what do we have? Faith, hope and charity. Now that's an interest, this faith, hope and charity, of course. Now this is a Spes, Caritas and Fides. Now that's Spes, Caritas, Fides, hope, charity and faith. Faith, hope and charity. In 1 Corinthians 13:13, so faith, hope and love abide here, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Now faith, hope and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And love is also interchangeable with charity, caritas. Now it's very embedded in the Christian tradition, but it goes back much further as well. So this is St. Mary's Cathedral here in Sydney, and just there on the outside we see this relief, faith, hope and charity. Now in the various paintings, iconography, we see faith, hope and charity, but with Sophia or wisdom. Sophia is wisdom. Now we can draw some connections to the Masonic. So this is a relatively modern tracing board, but we still have the 3 columns, again repeated themes, Doric, Ionic and Corinthian, and the Ionic column represents the woman, or also known as the column of wisdom. And again, these simple swirls are said to represent the simple unadorned beauty of a woman, as opposed to the Corinthian column here, which represents the maiden or the virgin, which is very elaborate. So again, especially back in Greek times, you would dress your unmarried daughter in with a lot of jewelry and a very nice hair, very nice clothes, to make her more and more attractive as well. So, but as where the Ionic column, which represents the mature woman, is more simple and about wisdom as well. So, but this connects again to the Christian tradition with faith, hope and charity depicted with wisdom or Sophia. And so again, and this was all, of course, resurrected during the Renaissance with a rebirth of classical architecture and these themes. But this goes back to Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And again, a recent upload I mentioned the rod of Asclepius there and how it connects to Medusa. So the blood of Medusa, after she was killed by Perseus, Athena gave that blood to Asclepius, the son of Apollo, god of healing, he was able to turn mortals into immortals. And so now Chief Secretary's building, there we see Wisdom, which is Athena, and the owl, Bubo, and often depicted with the in his millet with the shield and the sword and the spear and the helmet. Athena being the goddess of defensive warfare, as where Mars, the god Mars, is the male, and he is more on the offensive side of warfare. We also see Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian architecture being stacked on top of each other. Again, in a relatively recent upload, I'll try to remember to put the links in the description because they all blend together. Now, this very old Christian is, well, it connects back to, and I won't go into depth because there is, we have the three graces, which are together charities, but again, this has so much within the Christian tradition. It goes back to earlier times, but it's also, of course, also very Masonic. But we have the acanthus column, or the Dancers of Delphi, and with the acanthus leaf, this column, and the three ladies there. Well, the acanthus, now the Corinthian order of architecture, so we have the three orders of architecture I mentioned, for instance there, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Now they would also link to, well, back to here, and the third column, the Corinthian order, is the column of beauty, as I said, the maiden or the virgin. It's much more complicated, so as opposed to the Ionic, the column of wisdom, or the female, the column of the maiden or the virgin, again with a much more complicated hairstyle, more jewelry, as I mentioned, touched on earlier, just a second ago. So there we have the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. RPA, the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, again I mentioned it earlier, but Corinthian, Doric, and Ionic columns again. And we also have the Palmet, which was a recent upload as well. Mentioned it. These videos I've again covered all of this in the long form, going through Canadian cities, state capitals in the US, New York, again Paris, London, and these other places. But just as doing these one-offs. Now, down there at the entrance we have, and now abideth faith, hope, and charity. These three, but the greatest of these is charity. And again, we can go back to Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 13:13, faith, hope, and love, or faith, hope, and charity. It's basically, it's just been lifted, that quote there. So faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And faith, hope, and charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. So it's now the RPA itself was created by, so Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's son, come to visit Australia. There was an assassination attempt, and this was at a Freemasons picnic here in Sydney. And the Grand Master of the lodge there, William Vile, put himself in front of and basically grabbed the would-be assassin. And Prince Alfred gifted him a wine jug, and as well as a considerable amount of money. Now, William Vile did not accept the money. He donated that as in an act of charity, and that led to the creation of the RPA, Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. So Royal Prince Alfred almost assassinated. Strong, and the building itself I mentioned earlier, 144. Well, the building itself, I did an independent video on this. 144 is embedded as especially throughout this building. It's just it just is. It always is. And it's a number as well. Now, but faith, hope, and charity is also very strong in the Masons tradition. So here we see faith, hope, and charity, Mason's ring, faith, hope, and charity, various boards, faith, hope, and charity. Again, over and over. Now that goes back to this earlier, this modern tracing board where we have the columns, but we also have faith, hope, and charity depicted in a different way. So it's in different forms, but it's the emblem continues throughout. Sometimes it's in a literal sense, and at other times more symbolic. For instance, this is another Mason tracing board, and it doesn't say faith, hope, and charity, but that's where it is. Faith, charity, and hope. I think that's the way they go. Sorry, but there again. So this is a pin, Mason's pin, faith, hope, and charity, the cross, the heart, and the anchor. And there we see the cross, the heart, and the anchor. Each one of these symbols has multiple levels of meaning. So, each one I could go on for quite some time, but again, it's not just this. It's also all of these things, multiple levels. So there we see the three ladies and Spes, Caritas, and Fides. So again, sometimes it's written, sometimes it's depicted with the anchor, the heart, and the cross. Sometimes it's with the ladies, but these Mason emblems, also Oddfellows and other such groups, the Christian rituals and will be embedded into them, but we also see, especially older Masonic tradition will have more Hellenistic tradition, sort of Greco-Roman built into them. And so, for instance, so there, that's what I mean. So like this, a lot of what is Christian is actually has been inherited from previous cultures, and then it's been moved into, like for instance, the Masonic tradition. Okay, now the Oddfellows is another, not as well known, but it's in the same vein of Freemasons. Now, for instance, in Australia, in South Australia, for instance, we had a strong presence of the Oddfellows, IOOF, Independent Order of Oddfellows. There's also the Manchester Unity Oddfellows, but the National Pharmacy chain was founded by the Oddfellows. The Oddfellows had a huge impact in influence on the early growth of medicine and hospitals in Australia and elsewhere. So especially up to around World War One period, there was the average working man couldn't just apply for health insurance. He couldn't just get credit from the bank. He couldn't get easy access to lawyers. You had to be a member of a lodge. And so these earlier lodge, which are also mutual aid associations, Knights of Columbus in America, or Oddfellows internationally pretty much, Masons, Druids, Buffaloes are some of these other groups. For instance, Fred Flintstone was a Buffalo. Well, Buffaloes was not just this strange group where men would sort of wear weird hats and do these. It was mutual aid societies. You could not get the health insurance, credit, access to lawyers, scholarships, widows insurance. This was not provided by the large corporations or by the government as it is now. It was done, people getting together to help each other out. They would pool their money together. And so, even for instance, the pharmacy, by being a member of a lodge, there was a lot of snake oil merchants at the time. So people such as the Oddfellows, and that's why the National Pharmacy chain in South Australia, the state of South Australia, by joining a lodge, you would be guaranteed high quality medicines. You wouldn't get snake oil. They would hire a pharmacist, a doctor, a lawyer. All these services we take for granted now were only accessible to the average person through these types of organisations. For instance, now the Druids, they would dress up as Druids and they would have marches. They would organise carnivals and fetes. But this was them organising money to open a hospital in Kurri, so the Newcastle area, just to the north of Sydney. And again, they're the same tradition, mutual aid organisations, but also a lot of we take so much for granted now, but it was only actually through the work of these types of groups that what we have is what we have. But in the nights, for instance, the New Deal was basically a government takeover to destroy these types of organisations. The Rockefellers were hugely involved with creating the Insurance Act. For instance, that's what happened to the New Deal in America. In Australia, we had the Insurance Act, and they went out of their way to break up mutual aid societies. So that's why you still get why these groups are demonized. Now, it's often Well, because they're a threat to government. They're a threat. Pardon me, the screen capture dropped out. But yeah, so druids, buffaloes, oddfellows, masons, prior to the emergence of large corporations providing health insurance, scholarships, these types of things, the average person could only get access to these types of services through these types of organisations, and that's pretty much the reason why they've been maligned, and especially through certain preachers who have attached satanic and all this type of stuff to them. Well, David Icke being another classic example. All you got to do is look into the history to find that this is disinformation. This is, how do you control the opposition? You own them, and that's why people like David Icke and Alex Jones get put on the mainstream media. They're the go-to guys for this stuff because they make it. Firstly, they make conspiracy theory look idiotic, but secondly, they can be guaranteed not to look into the important features of this. They're working for the establishment. So again, Masonic Children's Hospital, Minnesota, would be another example where now back to the RPA. Now on the inside, they even have the stained glass Caritas, Faith, Hope, and Caritas, or Charity. For instance, there's a large organized Caritas International. Now, back now, some other aspects. So, for instance, the Shriners is another important group directly connected to the Masons. This is from the Masonic Museum here in Sydney, and we have the Shriners. They're more famous for those guys who ride the little bikes and the little cars. Historically, still to this day, they're raising money. It's acts of charity, good works. This is one of the things that historically, and still, to this day, that what these societies were all about. They were about providing these services, and again, now corporations and the government has interfered, and they're a threat to them. For instance, back in ancient Rome, attempts to set up mutual aid societies, firefighting clubs were banned by Roman emperors. Now, I'm going to put a link in the description to a great video which touches on this. Bitbutter, how government solved the healthcare crisis. It talks about lodge practice, and especially in the healthcare system. Back in the 1920s, there was a healthcare crisis, and the crisis was that healthcare was so cheap and so accessible that the AMA, also legal services through the Law Society, they were threatened. They hated the fact that lawyers and doctors were competing against one another to win lodge contracts. And so the healthcare crisis we have now, it's too expensive. Back then it was too cheap and too accessible. This video touches on it, talks about lodge practice. We can transfer that to Oddfellows, Shriners, Buffaloes, and Masons, and all this type of stuff, and then ask the question, why are these David Icke type of people never ever speak about this? Well, they work for the Rockefellers, if you want to put it that way. And again, if you follow this through, you can find how the Rockefellers were directly involved in breaking up these organizations. The New Deal was in the US was an attempt, well, not an attempt, a successful action to break up lodge practice and self-help mutual aid organizations. When we helped each other out, no one cared about the working man back then, and that's why they had to get together and form mutual aid societies. Then these societies grew into the early insurance companies, and not only the power but also the profits. The greedy people, they saw it and they took it over. This is historical fact. It's quite well detailed. I'll eventually get around to doing a history of the Oddfellows and put this beyond doubt. And again, why are these? Firstly, this is not ever talked about in general terms, and when it is, it's attached to some sort of evil practice. These what we need to do is look back at this and re-embrace this type of system, faith, hope and charity, but especially mutual aid. And yeah, so the government wasn't building hospitals, the corporations wasn't building hospitals, they weren't providing scholarships, health insurance. Credit unions, for instance, was another birth of these organizations. You could not get, if you did not have the collateral, you're not rich, the bank wouldn't even look at you. It was only through building societies that the average person was able to get access to quality medicine, quality healthcare, legal representation, scholarships, widows insurance. And again, it's a crying shame that this has been allowed by certain, the usual suspects to turn this into evil. No, it's the opposite of that. Now, if any organization, if you look deep enough in individuals or little cabals or, little conspiracies within them, you will find nastiness going on. Let's not pretend every organization and every person is wonderful, but that can be said for any group, any organization. And to then put the deeds of the few onto the many, well, that's not a good thing. But yeah, faith, hope, and charity, and it's a Christian thing, it's a Masonic thing, but it's also into the older societies, and these emblems, symbols, and also practices are a very important part, and something we should re-embrace. To look after your neighbor, and if we all looked after one another, we wouldn't need the corporations, we wouldn't need big government, and with this has been lost. So faith, hope, and charity, this symbolism, these ethics, and these practices are very, very important. And again, unfortunately, it's the meaning of it has been lost or abused or twisted by the usual suspects, and so really is something worth looking at. And it's easy to point fingers, but when you scratch the surface a little bit and you look at the recorded history of these things, it's 100% topsy-turvy to what the internets, the majority of people on the internet would say. This is a very Christian thing, if you want to put it that way, but mutual aid, and yeah, this is where it comes from, and it's faith, hope, and charity, the lodge system, really something worth looking into, And anyway, with that, hope you enjoyed and have a good one.